Hey guys, I bet you've seen a lot of isekai animes, but I'm sure you've never seen one like this before. Here's the story. A man who has been known since childhood as a prodigy in sweet making goes to a competition to see who can create the most beautiful sweet. Unfortunately, the peacock-shaped sweet he makes falls on him, and, being very heavy and hard, ends up sending him to the other side. After that, he is reborn as a boy, and his dream is to make lots of sweets in that world, but for that, he'll need to learn magic and martial arts first. And that's the story I'm going to tell you today. But first, give me a like here on the video and subscribe. It really helps me out. Okay, let's go to the recap. The anime starts by showing our protagonist in his past life. He's in a sweet competition which will decide who the world's best pâtissier is. For those who don't know, a pâtissier is someone specialized in the creation and making of sweets, desserts, and the like. We see here that he is known as the god pâtissier. In the grand final of the competition, he decided to make a beautiful big bird, and he was confident he would win the competition. However, at some point, his giant sweet falls right on top of him, seriously injuring him. Lying on the ground, losing his life, he laments and says he would have liked to create the world's best sweets before going to his grave. He says that God is very cruel to make him go out this way. And at that moment, a voice speaks to him and says that it will give him a new chance. It tells him his new name in this other world, which is a very long name, so we'll just call him Pastry, which is his first name. And then, we already see him with his new parents. And after a time skip, Pastry is now a bit older. He explains to us a bit about that world. He says his father is the Lord Suzerain of a region. However, the place where they live is very arid, and it was impossible to grow wheat or barley. His father worked hard alongside those who followed him and those who already lived in the area, and, after many years, they were able to make the soil in that place fertile. The work paid off, and they quickly managed to create large plantations that fully supplied the residents of that region. After this quick explanation, we see Pastry training swordsmanship with his father. He is already 9 years old, and yet he is the best with the sword after his father. Everyone sees him as a prodigy. He explains that his father is a military hero, and his mother is a kind and gentle lady. He says that it really is a peaceful village, but something bothers him a lot, which is the fact that their fief can't grow sugarcane to make sugar, and so it's very difficult for him to make sweets, which has always been his dream since his past life. While he's training, he starts thinking about sweets and gets distracted, making him easily defeated by his father. Then, one of his father's servants arrives and says there's good and bad news. Pastry's father tells him to speak the good news first, and he does. The good news is that thanks to Pastry's guidance, they achieved an excellent grain harvest. And the bad news? The soldiers failed to eliminate the bandits who invaded a neighboring town, and now those bandits are coming toward their region. Pastry's father is worried, as they will probably destroy the crops and kill many people when they arrive. Pastry says there are about 50 bandits, and they must prepare, as the bandits will arrive in approximately 2 months. Pastry ponders and says that even if they join the 3 villages in the region, they will have at most 30 men, and it will be difficult to stop them with just that. At some point, the blonde guy sees Pastry's serious expression, and in his thoughts, he says that's the look of a future leader, someone who wants to defend his family and neighbors. But what he doesn't know is that Pastry is angry about the possibility of losing the wheat he'll use to make his sweets. Pastry, very angry, says in his thoughts that he will cut down anyone who tries to ruin his dream of creating a land of sweets. The guy only thinks about making sweets. Man. The blonde guy says they have a chance. His instinct is telling him to bet on Pastry, and the Lord asks him what he means by that. He responds that it's obvious, they should baptize Pastry so that he can use magic and help in the fight against the bandits. His father resists a little, but eventually agrees, even though it's a bit early, since the boy is only 9 years old, and normally the coming of age ritual happens at age 11. Later, he tells Pastry's mother that he will do this, leaving her very worried. Says she would like Pastry to live his childhood more and that it's not fair that he has to undergo the ritual at such a young age. But his father stamps his foot and says he will do it, because if he doesn't, they might all end up in trouble. She resists a lot, but eventually accepts. A few days later, they go Pastry says goodbye to his friends and then his father uses teleportation magic. Pastry arrives in the city and is very surprised by the fruits there. Since there's nothing like that in his region, he starts to fantasize about the various sweets he could make with all those fruits. His father says he will buy whatever he wants after the completion of the passage ritual. And after that, they proceed to the church. The priest receives them and is surprised to learn that such a young boy is the one to perform the ritual. But he accepts it. He makes the preparations and finally, the ritual is about to begin. Basically, he is tied and strapped to a chair and drinks a strange and bitter liquid. For a few hours or days, he will be blindfolded and isolated from any external contact until his magic manifests. And soon the ritual begins. Pastry's father thought it wouldn't last more than a few hours, just like it happened to him. However, it has been more than a day and still nothing. His father starts to worry, thinking it's been tough for Pastry. But that's not the case. He has been spending all that time thinking about the different types of sweets he could make with those apples he saw in the city. Eventually, Pastry finally manifests his magic, and the ritual is concluded. His father comes to talk to him and is very happy, saying that he did very well. He meditated for 2 full days and was able to manifest a large amount of magic. And after that, the ceremony is concluded with a kind of magical scroll, and now, Pastry is officially an adult and is recognized by the church. Now finally, he can use magic without any hindrance. The priest says that he has received a practically unique power in modern times. And there are few records of someone who has managed to attain such a large amount of magic. After that, he pays the priest and they leave. Finally, for Pastry, the time has come for him to choose the fruits he would like to take home. He picks some apples but is very indecisive about which ones to choose. Finally, he makes his choice and they leave. At this moment, that priest appears, and we see that he's a rascal. He complains about receiving only silver coins and calls Pastry's father poor, also saying that such a trifling amount of money won't be enough to keep him silent. Mark my words, I'm sure this rascal priest will cause problems in the future. Then, we are shown that a village has been completely destroyed by the bandits who are coming towards Pastry's fief. And thanks to this, his father is organizing everything for their defense. He has gathered all the residents in one place to avoid isolated attacks. He has also blocked the wells of the neighboring villages so that the bandits have no supplies and only have one place to attack, which is exactly where they are, thus making defense easier. Everyone is working hard to defend against the bandits' attack. At a certain point, he receives news that the bandits will arrive sooner than they thought. Pastry hurries and calls his friends to collect many stones to be ready before the attacks. They spend the day collecting until, at the end of the day, the boys spot a large group of bandits coming towards them. They run to the city and warn the adults that the bandits are very close. Upon hearing this, Pastry's father wastes no time and sends his blonde assistant to reconnoiter the bandits. Meanwhile, Pastry is working on a plan for the children to implement during the attack, since they can't be on the front line. We return to Pastry's father, and the blonde guy uses a tracking skill to see where and how many bandits there are. He says he detected at least 70 bandits, and they are heading towards their camp. They also noticed that these aren't common bandits, they are actually a gang of EX Knights, and therefore, they are very skilled in combat. They quicken their pace and head towards the location. Upon arrival, they quickly dispatch several of the supposed bandits. This leads to some casualties, which facilitates the defense of the fief. After that, they quickly run back to the fief, luring the bandits to follow them. Upon reaching the village, Pastry's father passes close to the wall they built, and Pastry puts his plan into action. He takes some children who are skilled with slings, and they start throwing stones at the bandits. They keep throwing until the leader of the bandits realizes it's a trap and starts climbing the wall to go after the children to stop the attack. He climbs up and the villagers try to stop him with scythes and agricultural tools. But unfortunately, it doesn't work, and the rascal EX Knight manages to get over the wall and jumps inside. Once inside, he starts beating up all the villagers who try to prevent him from reaching the children. He causes great damage, and meanwhile, the children keep throwing stones at the scoundrel bandits. The leader gets furious with them and cowardly quickly goes to attack one of the children. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Pastry steps in front and ends up receiving the sword strike in front of her. The least bad thing is that it was in the arm and won't cause major complications. The cowardly bandit takes Pastry hostage and warns the people not to come closer, or he will harm the boy big time. Pastry doesn't know what to do, but at a given moment, he notices a bandit lying on the ground with his eyes burned from the flaming stone. That hit him. Pastry then gets an idea. He uses a spell to transfer the bandit's injury to all the other bandits there. It works perfectly, and soon, they all start rolling in pain, with their eyes burning, quickly defeated by Pastry. Then, it also shows us the bandits who were captured being taken to some sort of shed to wait until the capital folks arrive to take them away. Pastry's father talks to his right-hand man, saying it's best to send them to the capital. This way, the countess would receive credit for having captured them, instead of just driving them away, as actually happened. He thinks that doing it this way will earn him a great reward from her, and she would get credit for having captured them. To him, it seems fair, since the region where he lives is very barren, and they need resources to rebuild the villages the bandits destroyed. Some time later, he makes a list of those who helped during the battle to give them a reward. First is Glassage, a strange name. For his bravery and courage, he is gifted a spear and a silver coin, and the young man thanks them. Next up are Marcarolo and Luminito, those friends of Pastry. Pastry's father says both served very well as his assistants. Because of that, each of them will receive a sword and a bag of barley. Afterwards, the two of them head home, finding the bag of barley they received to be heavy. Soon, Pastry appears. He praises them and says they did really well in the battle. Soon, they arrive at Mark's house. His younger siblings say he's amazing, and his mother is overjoyed that he's come back safely. Afterward, they go to Lumi's house. Her grandfather hugs her and says his granddaughter is truly amazing. After this, he says they should celebrate, and a party with many people begins. At one point, Pastry starts daydreaming about all the sweets he'll be able to make during these times of peace. While he's lost in his thoughts, Mark and Lumi slip away and start talking. Mark asks what happened to the bandits, and Lumi says they were put in a shed. The boy suggests they should go take a look at them, and soon Lumi agrees, if this doesn't go wrong, I'm an astronaut. They head to the shed, but the guards stop them, saying it's not a place for children. Afterward, Mark picks up some stones from the ground and throws them at some woods next to the shed. The guards hear it and hurry to see what happened. In this moment, Mark and Lumi slip inside the shed where the bandits are held. Inside, they come face to face with the bandit leader, who instills fear in them just with a look. The bandit says the sword on Mark's belt belongs to him and asks where he got it. Mark says it was a reward. The bandit puts on a show and says he'll surely be in a grave when they hand him over, so he'd like to teach the next owner how to use that sword properly. He says that if it's used correctly, he could even use magic, and of course, this captures Mark's eyes, as he's always wanted to use magic like Pastry. But obviously, this is a trap, and Lumi warns him and tells them to leave. However, Mark is desperate for power and does as the bandit asks. The rascal says he must say some magic words, but they're very dangerous, so he asks Mark to come closer so his friend won't hear. Like a duck, Mark approaches him, and in the meantime, the bandit loosens his ropes. When Mark gets close, he gets kicked in the stomach, and the bandit frees himself. He grabs the sword and runs to attack Lumi. Obviously, she can't defend herself and receives a serious cut to her side. At this moment, the guards arrive, and the bandit leader takes Mark hostage. He grabs a horse and speeds away with the boy. At this moment, Pastry arrives and tells the guards to take care of Lumi. Outside, he asks the direction the bandit went and quickly sets off after the rascal. As Pastry goes after the bandit, he starts thinking of strategies on how he could defeat him. At this moment, we see that Pastry's father has been informed that his son is after the bandit, and he decides to go after him too. However, his assistant advises against it, saying he should stay and try to control the situation. The blonde kid says he'll go himself since he can track him down more easily using his tracking abilities. We switch back to the bandit, and we notice that one of Pastry's traps work, causing the bandit to fall. Immediately, Pastry arrives and stands in front of Mark to defend him. He recalls his father's sword training and attacks the bandit. The bandit comments that Pastry's skills are not bad for a kid. The bandit already knows that Pastry can transcribe wounds, so he is careful not to let Pastry see any cuts. He advances towards Pastry, who ends up trapped. At one point, the bandit attacks so strongly that he breaks Pastry's sword and would soon deliver a final blow to the boy. At least, that's what it seems, but but you'll understand what happened in a moment. The anime cuts to another scene, and we see the blonde kid searching for Pastry. At some point, he finds the trail of Pastry's horse and then finds his broken sword. Thinking that the boy had perished, he doesn't know how to break the news to his friend. But to his surprise, upon arrival, he finds Pastry sitting on his mother's lap. He shouts out. Pastry's father says that he returned a while ago and that he has already taken Mark to his house. The blonde kid is shocked because he was sure that the boy had met his end. Afterward, Pastry's father asks him to explain exactly what he did to escape the bandit and avoid the watchful eye of his assistant. Pastry tries to dodge the question, saying it's a complicated situation and hard to explain. His father gets angry and demands that he explain it right away. Pastry then sees no alternative and admits that he copied his father's teleportation magic and used it on himself. They are impressed because this way he can copy the magic of anyone. The boy is almost like a Kakashi. His father, angry, says that from now on, he is forbidden to tell anyone that he can use other people's magic, because if the Empire finds out, they might use the boy as a weapon. He also says that he should not use teleportation frequently because it's very dangerous, and he could end up inside the ground if he's not careful. The next day, Pastry goes to talk to Mark and notices that the boy is very sad. Pastry asks why, and the boy responds that it's because of him that Lumi got hurt and that if he had listened to her, none of this would have happened. Pastry comforts him and says he should go and apologize to her if he's really sorry. The boy agrees and they go to visit their friend. They arrive, and Lumi seems to be doing well. She asks why they're visiting. Pastry asks how she's doing, and she says she's improving. Afterward, Pastry says he'll be in the kitchen for a while and leaves her alone with Mark. She asks why he's so down. Before he can respond, we see Pastry using ingredients like apples, sugar, and butter. We return to Lumi and Mark, and the boy has trouble opening up to her. Finally, he gathers his courage and apologizes for causing her injury because he didn't listen to her. The girl promptly says it's okay, and then a delicious apple pie aroma fills the room, and Pastry appears with a delicious apple pie. He says now that Mark has apologized, they should eat to celebrate. They take the first bite and say that the pie is absolutely amazing. They begin eating non-stop. But at some point, Lumi's father appears and seems really angry at Mark. He says it was him who hurt his dear daughter and he must face the consequences. However, he was just intimidating the boy, and he says that as compensation, Mark will have to marry his daughter when he's older. He says it's a good opportunity since his daughter is a tomboy and would never be able to get a man otherwise. He asks her if she liked the idea, and Lumi, thinking about eating, nonchalantly says it's no problem. Mark is desperate. Afterward, Lumi offers a piece of pie to her father, and Pastry takes one too. As expected, he finds it incredible, and when Mark asks about his piece, she says that everything belongs to the husband belongs to the wife, so she'll keep the last piece. Well, here we see that he's in trouble, and you should all be careful when getting married. Pastry's father saying they don't have any money and need resources to rebuild the villages that were damaged. They also need food to sustain the people while they rebuild. He mentions that if they could catch the bandit leader who escaped, they could get at least 200 gold coins for him. He also says that the remaining ruffians are not even worth 5 coins. They try to figure out a way to get money and start brainstorming. Later, Pastry plays with his friends and shares the money problem with them. Pastry asks how Lumi's wound is, and she says she's doing well, just feels a bit of pain. Mark suggests she take it easy, and at that moment, Pastry laughs, saying they really make a nice couple. This makes Mark angry, and he says this joke isn't funny. Then, Mark admiringly comments on Pastry's magic and asks him to teach them how to use it. First, Pastry gives them a demonstration. He asks the two of them to draw something they like on the ground. After they draw, Pastry uses his rewriting magic to create a copy of the drawings and transfer them onto their skin, creating a sort of magic tattoo. Then, Lumi asks him if he can do the opposite. Instead of copying a drawing onto someone, could he copy another person or object to create something like a portrait? Pastry finds this idea amazing and wondered why he had never thought of it. He thanks Lumi for the idea and runs off excitedly, certainly thinking of a way to make money. While his father was talking to his mother, Pastry returns with a piece of wood and says he has an idea on how they can make money. His father asks what the plan is, and Pastry asks if he remembers the attempts to arrange a marriage for Josie, his sister. His father remembers, but doesn't understand how they would make money with it. Pastry explains that thanks to his teleportation ability, he was able to take her to various places to present her. However, few people have this ability since they can't use magic. This is where Pastry's idea comes in. Pastry asks how best to introduce a daughter if they want to arrange a marriage for her. His father suggests that the most effective way is to have her participate in a royal ball in the capital, but transportation is dangerous and costs a lot of money. Pastry suggests that if they sold something like that, and shows them the piece of wood, with his mother on it. He puts magic into the board, and his mother's image appears in detail, almost like a photograph. They are all impressed, and Pastry says his idea is to sell photos of the girls for their introduction without them being present. This way, they could save a lot of money for the parents of the girls, and they would charge a much lower price than the expensive photographs in that world. His father finds the idea incredible and says it could work. The assistant mentions that people could discover Pastry's magic this way, but Pastry says they can't hide his magic forever, and he can claim that his magic is only used to create photographs. His father agrees and goes back to talking to his assistant. Meanwhile, Pastry's mother comes over quietly and asks if he can remove a wrinkle she saw in the photo. Some time later, Pastry and his father go to the Countess Reedy's castle to seek a reward for dealing with the bandits she let escape. They are received by the guards and are soon admitted. The Countess from above begins mockingly, asking if they came to reprimand her for failing to deal with the bandit threat. Her assistant tells her not to fear the reprimand of any nobleman. She agrees and says she will just flatter him and send them away. Then, Pastry and his father arrive in the room where she is. She greets them and says it's a pleasure to receive Lord Morton and his son. She introduces herself as Countess Reedy's. Pastry's father returns the pleasantries and expresses his gratitude for having a moment with the Countess. She talks about Pastry and comments on his charm. Then, she invites them to have tea. Pastry is impressed with all the sweets he sees on that table and gets really excited. The Countess says they prepared the best quality sweets and honey tea for their visit. Pastry's father thanks her and mentions that her teas are well known even in the royal capital. He takes a sip and says it's really delicious, and then Pastry picks up a cookie and takes a bite. The Countess watches him, expecting him to be delighted, but instead, the boy makes a dissatisfied face. Thinking to herself, she mentions that usually, children get excited to eat her sweets, and she doesn't understand why Pastry is making such a face. Then he drinks the tea, and his expression isn't much better. After that, the Countess mentions that his father's farms stand out even in such arid lands. Pastry's father says that it's all thanks to taking his son's advice, but the Countess doesn't believe him and calls him humble. Then she finally speaks to Pastry and comments that he must be proud to have a father like his. Pastry seizes this opportunity and agrees, saying he is very proud of his father. He then becomes serious and mentions that the estate his father worked so hard to build recently suffered a terrible attack. He explains that they were attacked by hundreds of bandits, and even children like him were forced to take up arms and fight. The Countess, thinking to herself, admits she never thought the boy would bring up such a topic. She tells him that it's splendid to see him assuming the responsibilities of nobility at such a young age. Pastry continues, saying that when they interrogated the bandits, they claimed to have come from the region of Retesvale, which is the Countess's territory, and she should have dealt with them. The Countess attempts to play dumb and asks if this is true. Pastry then plays his final card. He has a sword he took from the bandits, which belongs to the Countess's army and was likely taken from a night when the bandits passed through. Pastry mentions that if she can't remember, that's fine, and he'll hand the bandits over directly to the royal capital, where an official investigation will likely reveal that the Countess was responsible for all the damage. Pastry puts pressure on her, and she has no choice but to negotiate a generous reward for them. The Countess starts offering 100 gold coins, but Pastry refuses immediately, saying he wants a bit more. She offers 130, and he rejects it right away, until she offers 150, and finally, he accepts. The Countess, thinking to herself, remarks that this kid is not normal. Usually, parents handle negotiations in such situations, and she starts to believe that their estate's success really stems from the boy. Pastry counts the coins and tells his father they have exactly 150 coins. They thank her, and Pastry apologizes for his impudent remarks, saying it was necessary. She says he hasn't introduced himself yet, and Pastry promptly introduces himself and mentions that it was a pleasure to meet her. She asks if she can ask him a question. Pastry confirms, and she asks what he thought of the tea, as he made a disapproving face when he first tried it. Pastry says there's no problem with the tea, it was very good. However, he adds that the cookies weren't a good match since they were too sweet and overpowered the tea's flavor. He advises her to pair the tea with lighter sweets to enhance the tea's flavor even more. She compliments his refined palate and is astonished by everything he said. Pastry's father gives him a light cuff on the head and apologizes for his son's impudence. Pastry quickly apologizes to her and, as a gesture of apology, takes out a small handkerchief and uses his magic to create a portrait of the Countess. She is very surprised and says it's wonderful. Today's episode starts with Duke Cattlesec welcoming Pastry and his father. They are at a celebration for the Duke's grandson's coming of age. Pastry's father mentions that it's an honor to be invited to a banquet hosted by the high nobility. Next, the Duke introduces his grandson, who happens to be a big fan of Pastry's father, a famous war hero. After that, Pastry introduces himself, and the Duke remarks that he indeed has good manners. At some point, the Duke mentions that he heard Pastry, like his father, possesses the gift of magic and asks the boy to demonstrate his powers. Pastry asks one of the waiters for a cloth and uses his magic to create a portrait of a girl on it. He then presents the portrait to the Duke's grandson, Squale, who is highly impressed and finds the girl in the portrait very beautiful. Pastry decides to set his plan in motion. He reveals that the girl's name is Petra, the daughter of the Marquis of Huberec. However, due to their conflict with another kingdom, she couldn't attend Squale's celebration in person. Squale is enchanted by Petra and expresses his desire to meet her as soon as possible. The Duke realizes that they are arranging a marriage, and although Squale is already smitten with Petra, he agrees to meet her later. With this settled, Pastry discreetly approaches the Duke and suggests that the Marquis of Huberec might be using his daughter's marriage to form an alliance and end the long-standing conflict. He advises the Duke to stay vigilant, and thus Pastry gains the old man's trust. Shortly thereafter, the Duke suddenly announces to everyone that his grandson will likely find his future wife, so they should celebrate and feast. Afterward, Squale approaches Pastry and asks for his help. Pastry thinks Squale wants some sweets to gift to Petra and gets excited about it. However, Squale's request is quite different. He asks Pastry if he can modify the portrait to make it more sensual. Well, at that age, hormones are raging, I understand. Later, they return home, and we see that the village's reconstruction is in full swing. Pastry then talks to his father, handing him 2 letters that contain information about the arranged marriage. However, their mission isn't over yet, they must ensure Petra's safety until the wedding. They quickly devise a plan for Petra's escort and protection to the capital. Everything is settled, and Pastry hands his father a monthly cost report before sneaking off. Just before he leaves, his father shouts and asks what he sees. Apparently, Pastry bought a barrel of sugar and a whole box of apples. Pastry's father is utterly exasperated and tells him he'll lose his allowance until he forgives him. Pastry is really obsessed with sweets. Some time later, they go to the Marquis's mansion to initiate the escort and transport of Petra and her sister. Pastry and his father aim to ensure everything goes smoothly and safely. They approach the carriage, and Petra greets them. However, her sister, Nicholas, seems a bit sad and doesn't greet Pastry. They set off on their journey and finally arrive at the church, which is the initial phase of their plan. Pastry plans to take the girl to the underground chamber of the church, where something resembling a chamber is located. From there, they will use his father's magic to teleport them to the royal capital's church. However, as they approach, they notice some bandits waiting for them. When the carriage stops, the attack begins. Pastry's father starts fighting off several of them, and at one point, a bandit reaches the carriage door, about to attack one of the girls. But guess who's there to save the day? Of course, it's our protagonist, Pastry, bravely wielding his sword and taking on the dastardly bandit. They are saved, but the girls are completely terrified by the whole ordeal. Realizing this, Pastry goes to the 2 girls and reassures them that they don't need to worry since everything is okay now. He comforts them as they descend the stairs to the church's underground, and he notices that Nicholas is quite afraid. So, he decides to hold her hand and tells her it's all right because he's with her. The girl looks at Pastry, and it's evident that she's falling for him. Yep, our favorite pastry chef is becoming quite the heartthrob. The girl is surprised, and in her thoughts, she mentions that he's different from everyone else, not comparing her to her sister. She feels silly for thinking she's inferior to Petra just because she was chosen to marry first. At some point, they finally arrive at the location planned by Pastry. They stand in the center of the room and join hands. Then, Pastry's father uses teleportation magic, and in the blink of an eye, they are transported to the church in the royal capital. Upon arrival, the girls are amazed since they've never seen teleportation magic before. After that, we switch scenes and see a peculiar guy talking to some mercenaries. He says he brought them here for a simple job, to capture a girl and bring her to him. In return, he would pay them 10 gold coins, which is a substantial sum for them. The leader of the mercenaries questions if the payment of 10 gold coins implies that the girl is not just an ordinary one and asks the strange man if this girl belongs to the nobility. The man confirms that the target is Petra Huberek, the one who will be married soon. He explains that the intention is to prevent this marriage. The mercenaries discuss among themselves and ask the leader if they are really going to do this job. The leader says he has two objectives. One is to prevent the marriage because if the Duke allows his own grandson's bride to be kidnapped, it would be a great shame for him, as he is the leader of the central army of the kingdom. The second objective is for Armire, who wants to save the kidnapped girl, as this would raise his prestige and potentially lead to the nobility restoring his noble title. Now, we return to the church, and Pastry notices a large crowd outside. His father comments that the Marquis brought a lot of his own people to reinforce security, and the other part of the crowd consists of curious nobles who came to see the bride. Next, Petra seems a bit nervous, mentioning that it doesn't even feel real what's happening. Pastry reassures her, saying it will feel more real when she sees her fiancé, whom he praises as a good man. Petra admits that she found him quite handsome when she saw his portrait and blushes at the memory. Pastry smiles, thinking to himself that the idea of matchmaking photos was indeed a good business. Afterward, Petra is escorted by her father to the coming-of-age ceremony, the same ceremony we saw Pastry go through in one of the previous episodes. After this, Pastry's father instructs him to take Nicholas to a room so she can rest since she appears very nervous. Pastry goes to Nicholas, and as they enter the room, his father's assistant yells at him not to do anything strange with the young girl, leaving Pastry quite annoyed. Inside the room, Pastry tries to break the tension, but Nicholas' chaperone is strict and doesn't give any leeway. While he attempts to start a conversation, the room's floor starts glowing, and a massive hole suddenly opens up. Both Nicholas and Pastry fall into the hole. Hearing the noise, Pastry's father rushes to the scene and asks the maid what happened. She tells him that both the girl and Pastry fell into the hole. Pastry's father realizes that it was magic and instructs his assistant to gather more people for the search. He then jumps into the hole himself, hoping to trace the kidnapper. Now, we see Pastry and Nicholas have been kidnapped and are tied up on the ground. Pastry wakes up, and the bandit comes to speak with him. The bandit tells Pastry to continue being a good boy, and they will release him soon. Pastry asks why they were kidnapped, and the bandit says he doesn't owe him an explanation. Pastry starts thinking about who might be behind this and realizes they are probably after the girl, especially since she is of high nobility. At this moment, Pastry's father reaches the end of the hole, where Pastry fell, but unfortunately, he doesn't find anything or any clues as to where the bandits might have gone. We return to Pastry and Nicholas, and the girl finally wakes up. Pastry explains the situation to her but reassures her that he's with her and will save her soon. Pastry devises a plan and asks the kidnapper some questions to extract information. He soon discovers that the mastermind is indeed a noble, or ex-noble, seeking revenge. He recalls the list of possible names that could cause trouble and connects the dots, identifying the House of Armire as the likely culprit. With this information, Pastry knows where and who is behind it all. Pastry takes a small piece of his clothing and writes a message on it, which he then sends to his father. His father receives the message and understands the message, quickly heading towards Pastry's location. After this, the mustachioed mercenary returns, quite angry, saying that the noble scoundrel won't pay them anything because they kidnapped the wrong girl. The real target was Petra, Nicholas' sister. Consequently, he states that he will have to eliminate both Pastry and the girl since he can't leave any witnesses. When he was about to strike the girl, Pastry uses magic and appears in front of her, taking the blow meant for her and getting thrown away. The mustachioed mercenary threatens that Pastry will pay for this, and they engage in combat. However, all of this was part of Pastry's plan. He did it to get closer to the swords and manages to free himself from the restraints. He picks up one of the swords and, while the mercenary is focused on the girl, Pastry attacks him. Pastry then positions himself for a fight against the bandit, and a battle between the two begins. Pastry wielding a sword and facing the bandit who kidnapped him, Licorice. The bandit says he messed up by letting his guard down since to him, Pastry was just a regular kid. Then they hear the sound of people approaching, and Pastry gets excited because he knows it's his father's men. The bandit says this is not good at all, and now his only option is to run. However, Pastry says he won't let him escape so easily. He corners the scoundrel bandit and says there's nowhere for him to run. But the bandit uses his hole-digging magic to escape. Pastry tries to chase after him, but his father orders him to stay. After that, the knight from Licorice's family arrives along with Pastry's father's assistant and takes the girl to her father. Pastry says his goodbyes to her and then goes to talk to his father. Pastry discovers that the one behind all of this was the former Duke Amaya. They captured him as he tried to escape through the back. Pastry's father says that 20 years ago, they were investigated, and the Duke ended up losing his noble title. Apparently, he was leaking information from the kingdom to its enemies. Afterward, Pastry and his father investigate the disappearance of the scoundrel bandit. They return to the house, and Pastry is lost in thought. He mentions that he didn't sense much magic residue in the hole, indicating that the guy didn't have much mana and probably didn't get too far. Next, they return to the room where they were and realize the bandit was still in the hole, waiting for everyone to leave so he could escape. He says if this didn't work, he had no choice but to bury them both. He grabs his sword, and Pastry's father tries to advance, but Pastry stops him and says he'll be the one to fight the bandit. But don't worry, he had a plan. The bandit, thinking he's at an advantage, attacks Pastry with all he's got. However, in their first sword clash, the bandit's sword breaks, and Pastry whacks him on the head, defeating him easily. Pastry explains that he had transferred a crack from the wall to the bandit's sword earlier, making it very fragile, and a minimal impact would cause it to break. His father praises him, saying he did well. After that, a month passes, and it's the day of Squale and Petra's official engagement announcement. Pastry and his father were, of course, invited. Keep an eye on the episode because later our young protagonist will get into trouble and fall into the Marquis's trap. Pastry talks to his father, saying that it seems like everyone is very happy. Duke Cattlesec then appears to greet them. Morton congratulates the Duke on his grandson's wedding and thanks him for the invitation. The Duke says he should be the one thanking Morton since they were able to resolve previous issues without any losses, and he directs his thanks to Pastry for saving his grandson's sister-in-law. Pastry politely says he only did what a knight would do. Then he tells the Duke he wants to confirm something about the kidnapping and mentions some interesting points he noticed. Pastry says he noticed that the bandit was very cunning and meticulous, and it doesn't make sense for him to make such a simple mistake as kidnapping the wrong sister, unless he received incorrect information. This leads Pastry to believe that someone passed on incorrect information to him, indicating that a third group was behind all of this. The Duke nods in agreement. Pastry continues, and the Duke starts getting uncomfortable. Pastry mentions that this third group overlooked Armire in the capital, and that's why he got caught. The Duke, trying to play it off, asks who this third group could be. Pastry says it's whoever would benefit the most from all of this, of course. The Duke asks if Pastry is insinuating that he's responsible for all of this, and the boy ironically says no, he just has a fertile imagination because he's still a child. The Duke, deep in thought, says he thought Pastry was just a cub but is now realizing he's a lion. Pastry then says he wants to discuss a different matter. He mentions that their fief has difficulties with the harvest due to the arid soil, and because of the help they provided to the Duke, he would like to receive a reward to assist with their fief's expenses. The Duke gets angry and says that it's extortion. He asks what Pastry would do if he said that this aid goes beyond what he can provide. Pastry responds that if that's the case, maybe he can spill the beans to the Marquis who is right nearby. Man, this kid is really smart. The Duke, with no alternative, agrees to provide the aid that Pastry asked for. Pastry politely thanks him, and the Duke says he's bested him this time. After that, he confesses everything he did, and then the Marquis arrives to talk to them. And now, Pastry is in for a tough time. He can hardly wait to see what comes next, and I bet you can't either. But before I continue, go ahead and give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, alright? Show some support. Continuing, the Marquis arrives and greets them all, thanking them once again for saving his daughter from the kidnapping. He then asks Pastry if he has undergone the coming-of-age ceremony, and Pastry confirms that he has. Afterward, the Marquis says that a man with Pastry's abilities should have many admirers soon, and due to that, it wouldn't hurt to settle down already. Man, look at the trap the Marquis is setting for our naive Pastry. Pastry goes along with it, and the Duke continues. He asks if Pastry has already chosen the one he wants to marry, and the boy denies it, saying it's too early to decide. The Marquis, in turn, says that if he finds the right person, he should get married and secure his future. Pastry agrees, and his father already sees the trap that Marquis Huberek has set. However, Pastry responds poorly and says, yes, but he hasn't found the right person yet. The Marquis then plays his final card. He asks Pastry what he thinks of his daughter, Licorice. At this moment, Duke Cladesec sees that the boy is in trouble and starts laughing at him. Pastry also seems to have realized that he's in a trap. He answers that they've just resolved Petra's engagement, and it's too early for Licorice. The Marquis says that's nonsense because Licorice has also come of age. He adds that the girl also seems to like the idea of marrying him, and Pastry panics and doesn't know what to say anymore. Trying to evade, he says that it's an honor, but he doesn't consider himself worthy of a high noble girl like her. The Marquis then delivers his final blow to Pastry, asking the boy in an intimidating manner if he thinks his daughter isn't worthy of marrying. Now, Pastry has nowhere to run, and he's forced to accept the marriage. After that, the Marquis wastes no time and announces to everyone Pastry and Licorice's marriage. Pastry, thinking to himself, says he thought he was only going to prepare a small dessert, but out of nowhere, he'll have to make a huge wedding cake. Afterward, Licorice appears and comes to greet Pastry. She thanks him a lot for saving her on the day of the kidnapping, and Pastry is enchanted by her beauty. He tells her he's never seen her look so charming before. They raise a toast to the marriage of the four. Later, Pastry goes to talk to Petra, and she gives him some cookies she made. Pastry gets excited and starts eating, thinking they must be delicious due to their smell. However, as he eats, he realizes they are quite salty. But to avoid hurting his future wife's feelings, he says they're delicious and even asks for more. The girl is happy and smiles. Pastry, looking at this, says he will protect that beautiful smile for the rest of his life. The next day, Morton approaches his wife to inform her about Pastry's engagement. However, he explains it in a completely distorted way. He says he has something important to tell her. He tells his wife that he let another girl enter his life and leaves her shop. She tries to maintain her composure and says she didn't expect this. He continues to talk and says it was necessary because he was under tremendous pressure. Pastry's mother urges him to talk about the girl, and he says she's beautiful and comes from a good family. The woman is completely shocked, and to finish it off, he adds that she's a twin. This makes Agnes lose her composure and she goes to hit him. But trying to explain himself, he finally says that she is a good match for Pastry, and he accepted it too. Finally, she understands and sits down. Morton asks her what she thought it was, and she says she thought he was cheating on her. After that, Pastry comes to ask how his mother reacted after he told her, and his father says she will need some time to recover. Little do they know she's relieved not to be a cuckold and very happy to have a new daughter. Next, we're shown Countess Redes. She's informed that Pastry got engaged to the Marquis's daughter, and she's in shock. She even spills her tea on her lap. The Countess is really angry. She imagines that the Marquis orchestrated all of this to gain more influence, and he believes that Morton's fief has the potential to become prosperous on the same level as hers. This is. Next, we return to Pastry, and he's with his friends, receiving some boxes that the Duke sent as a gift. Inside, we notice there are some tree seedlings. Pastry is very happy because when those trees grow, they will be able to raise bees to produce honey, which is essential for making sweets. But Pastry faces a problem. He can't cultivate those trees with the arid soil they have. To solve this, they need water. However, the region experiences very little rainfall throughout the year, which will indeed be a problem for him. Pastry then has an idea. He will build a reservoir to store rainwater that will come soon. He says he'll make it big enough to store water for the entire year. After that, Pastry's father is receiving a report from his assistant, and they see that the fief has finally started to turn a profit. Morton says that all of this is thanks to his son, who is like an angel sent by God. Then, the assistant says he has two pieces of news for him, one is good, and the other is bad, and he asks Morton to choose which one to hear first. Morton chooses to hear the good news. The man says the good news is that the village received 40 more settlers, which means they have more labor, and they will grow even more. Then he asks the assistant to deliver the bad news. The guy says that Pastry came up with a new project, and they saw him with his friends in a nearby village planning something that will surely cause problems. Pastry's father is furious and goes after him to see what they are doing. We go back to Pastry, and he tests a new skill on a small hill. He uses it and succeeds, and we notice that he managed to transcribe the ability to dig holes from that rascal bandit. Now he has that skill for himself. Seeing that it worked, Pastry is very happy because it will make building the reservoir easier, and his dream of creating the land of sweets is getting closer to being achieved. Then he doesn't waste time and continues to dig the ground repeatedly. Finally, they find themselves inside a gigantic hole that will hold a lot of water. Mark notices that the soil is well compacted, and Pastry says, "Of course, that's how you make a reservoir." Pastry says he will plant the seedlings around it, and soon it will start raining. With the trees around, the reservoir will last a long time. He is very happy and says his plan is going perfectly. However, while he was fantasizing about his land of sweets, Lumi tells him to open his eyes and stop daydreaming. Pastry asks why, and soon he sees his father above, fuming with anger. He comes to Pastry, very upset, and asks the boy what on earth he was thinking to dig a hole that size. Pastry is completely frightened and tries to explain himself to his father, who doesn't want to hear it and scolds the three troublemakers. Next, we go back to Countess Reedes, and we notice that she's still very angry about Pastry's engagement. She says that if she had a daughter, she would have done it before. She also says that if she were 10 years younger or Pastry 10 years older, she would have proposed to him herself. The Countess says they need to bring Pastry to their side and tries to think of a plan. Finally, she seems to have plotted something. Then, a month passes, and we see that the reservoirs that Pastry planned have worked very well. Now, there are irrigation channels throughout the fief. Pastry, in turn, is very happy because his seedlings are already growing, and they will soon become large trees, which will allow them to produce honey for making sweets. At this moment, Pastry's sister appears and says she has a letter for him. She thinks it's from his fiancée, but when Pastry opens it, he realizes it's from Countess Reedes. Apparently, she invites him to a tea ceremony and says she wants the boy to taste the new teas she obtained. Pastry realizes she's up to something and becomes thoughtful. Then, Pastry goes to his home and looks for his father. However, he's informed that his father is not there at the moment. Pastry talks to his father's assistant until he finally arrives. Pastry talks to him, and Morton says he already knew about the Countess's invitation, as it was discussed in the capital. Pastry asks what she might want with this, thinking she might want revenge for the way he negotiated the reward for dealing with the bandits. However, his father believes it's not that, but he says they can discuss it later, as he has brought a special guest, and when that person enters, Pastry notices it's his fiancée, Licorice. He gets excited and goes to talk to her. He thinks it's just a visit, but soon he discovers that she will be staying with them for quite some time. For some reason, she will now live with them. Pastry is shocked upon hearing this and expresses his surprise by showing Lord Huberek talking to his assistant. He questions him about sending Licorice to live with Pastry and his family. Huberek, in turn, expresses irritation at the scheming going on behind his back by that shrewd woman. He also remarks that it's clear that Countess Reedes desires something involving Pastry. However, even for that conniving woman, it would be challenging to butter up Pastry with his fiancée by his side. Also, due to the escalating war, he wishes his daughter to stay somewhere safer. After that, we head to Pastry's kitchen. Licorice asks what he's doing. Pastry replies that he's making samples of sweets for the tea tasting ceremony he was invited to. Pastry starts adding ingredients like sugar, water, and honey, making Licorice quite curious about what that sweet could be. He keeps stirring until it turns into a thick, golden liquid. Licorice is impressed and remarks how good it smells. Once finished, Pastry pours some drops into a mold, shaping them with a stick. Then he reveals to Licorice that they're called hard candy, coming in various shapes, even an airplane, obviously something unknown in their world. Seeing her fiancé so enthusiastic about making sweets, Licorice is very happy. Meanwhile, outside, Pastry's mother, sister, and friends spy on them to see what they're up to. Next, Pastry uses the same liquid from the candies to make caramel apples. Licorice tries one and finds it delicious. After that, Pastry opens the door, and all the eavesdroppers tumble to the ground. His mother and sister come up with an excuse and swiftly leave, leaving only Lumi and Mark. Pastry says he was going to let the two try the caramel apples, but since they were spying on him and Licorice, he decides to give them to his father and his assistant, which saddens the two friends. Some time later, the day of the tea ceremony arrives. Pastry and Licorice attend with a bodyguard and Licorice's housekeeper. Upon arrival, they're surprised by the party's decoration, noticing an abundance of sweets and cookies. Pastry, seeing all this extravagance, can only imagine how many barrels of sugar he could buy with the money spent here. Man, this kid only thinks about making sweets. Afterward, the housekeeper scolds Pastry for not paying attention to his fiancée. He apologizes and then notices an image he created displayed on a canvas, suspecting the Countess deliberately placed it to flatter him. Then, the Countess's sycophant arrives to welcome them. Pastry thanks for the invitation, saying it's an honor to participate. In his mind, Pastry sees this as a great opportunity to promote the sweets he produces in his territory. Soon after, he introduces his fiancée, Licorice. He mentions she's never been to a southern noble gathering, which is why she's accompanying him. At this point, Coden introduces Pastry and his fiancée to everyone present in the hall. Pastry introduces himself, bringing a present as a token of gratitude. He claims it pairs well with the tea and urges everyone to try it. One by one, they taste Pastry's candy, there he goes, and they love it. They realize it indeed complements the tea excellently, enhancing its flavor. Then, Pastry makes his final move. He says he produces it on a large scale and could send it to them as a gift whenever needed. However, with one condition, they shouldn't impose taxes on sugar since products containing sugar have high tax rates. The noble guests find it fair, as it doesn't make sense to tax a gift given for free. At this moment, the schemer, the Countess arrives. She overhears everything and finds the proposal very interesting, expressing a desire to hear more about it. Pastry goes to speak with her, acknowledging the honor of her invitation. The Countess asks if that girl is his fiancée, and Pastry confirms. Then, the Countess expresses she'd love to learn more about his previous proposal, preferring all business matters to go through her. Pastry clarifies he wasn't negotiating, just discussing individual gifts. At this point, she invites Pastry for a private conversation, which he agrees to, asking Licorice to stay and reassuring her he'll be back. Licorice holds on to Pastry, but he assures her everything will be fine. He then accompanies the Countess to a room, noticing numerous guards and asking her if she thinks he would hurt her. She responds saying no, and if that were the case, there would be a lot more guards present. She adds that it's just for her safety, considering she's a very fragile woman, so it's important for her to protect herself. Pastry thinks to himself that she doesn't seem fragile at all to him. They start discussing business right away. She's quite direct, asking him not to play games and questioning what exactly he intends with everything he did a little while ago. Pastry, thinking to himself, decides he won't convince her by being polite, so he promptly hands her one of the candies he produced. The Countess praises the flavor, deeming it worthy of compliments even among the most sophisticated sweets. Pastry thanks her and mentions he made it himself, using just water, sugar, and honey. The Countess remarks it's quite simple. Pastry, in turn, expresses his hope that someday he can produce all the ingredients in his territory, surprising the Countess. He asserts that within just 3 years, he plans to mass-produce these sweets. The Countess, in her thoughts, questions if that would be possible on that arid and sandy soil. But knowing Pastry, she believes it might just be possible. Pastry continues, mentioning that since the Countess has access to a port, he'd appreciate her support in this endeavor. The Countess asks if that's why they discussed taxes, and the boy confirms it. The Countess, again pondering, suggests that Pastry's goal might be even greater than what he's talking about and wonders what future his eyes see. Nevertheless, she agrees to his proposal, stating she'll help him as much as possible but insists he provides those sweets to her. Pastry thanks her, and the Countess feels like she'll have the protagonist's future in her hands. Little does she know, Pastry is the one who already has her in the palm of his hand. After that, she asks what on earth that shape is, which is understandable since there are no airplanes in that world. Meanwhile, the Countess's assistant talks to Licorice and the other two about Pastry being the talk of the party. To hit Licorice emotionally, this scoundrel remarks that he's sure Pastry will have new admirers after that day and will certainly form new relationships at the event. As planned, this affects Licorice, who already has an inferiority complex. She starts thinking that Pastry will abandon her and expresses her desire to leave, then walks away. Back to Pastry, he and the Countess stroll down a corridor. Pastry remarks it was a pleasure doing business with her. The Countess, inquiring about his fiancée, mentions hearing that he protected her during the abduction, and he confirms it. She's convinced that Licorice fell in love after being impressed by him. Pastry expresses his happiness to have her as his fiancée and even says she's quite beautiful. The Countess notices he's embarrassed, so she hugs him from behind, startling the boy. She says she won't let go until he subscribes and leaves a like on the video. Actually, she won't let go until he admits he loves her. At this moment, Licorice opens the door and finds Pastry and the Countess cuddling. The Countess gives a malicious look as if everything was planned. The girl, already feeling insecure about not being enough for Pastry, now feels certain. She immediately runs off. Pastry goes after her, and the Countess doesn't seem bothered by what happened. Pastry finds Licorice feeling very down and sorry. He explains that the Countess sees him as a child and that's not what Licorice was thinking. Licorice says it's not just that, mentioning how in the hall earlier, several other women were talking about him, and listening to them made her start thinking about the worst possible scenarios, like him starting to like someone else and abandoning her. At this point, the girl starts crying. She recalls her sister, who is much more confident and can easily talk to everyone. She feels useless compared to her and thinks that if she were more like her, maybe he wouldn't leave her. Man, this girl needs to see a therapist, she's very insecure. Pastry places his hand over Licorice's, telling her that's who she is and she doesn't need to change. He likes her just the way she is and is sure he'll like her even more. Pastry asks her if she believes what he's saying. The girl confirms, and Pastry tells her to wait there, not to leave no matter what happens. Then, he teleports home and Licorice waits, until he returns with a present for her. He brings a caramel apple. Licorice asks if it's one of those he made before. He confirms, but says he made this one especially for her, and it even has a heart, making it different and exclusive for her. Pastry says he'd really like her to try it, and the girl does just as he asked. While eating, she remembers the moments she spent with him and starts crying tears of joy. She sees that Pastry has never looked at other women and feels more at ease. As a final move to capture her heart, Pastry mentions that this sweet has various names around the world, including the name Caramel Apple. He tells her that he infused his feelings for her into that sweet and asks if she believes him now. He expresses his desire to make her happy. Seeing her smile is what he wants most in the world. Man, this kid's a smooth operator. There's no way she won't fall for him. As expected, she says it's delicious and thanks Pastry. She quickly apologizes for thinking strange things. Pastry then takes her hands, and they both close their eyes, leaning in for a kiss. And now, my friends, our protagonist is about to have his first kiss. Well, that's what I'd like to tell you. However, just as their lips were about to touch, Pastry's housekeeper and bodyguard arrive and prevent the lovebirds from kissing. They're incredibly embarrassed, and Nicolo comes to talk to Pastry. Pastry asks since when they've been watching. Nicolo responds, saying since he came back with that caramel apple. He starts teasing Pastry for being head over heels and calls him the terror of women. Pastry gets annoyed and says his workload might increase significantly soon. He mentions that when they return home, he'll be working double. The boy gets desperate and apologizes. Meanwhile, the housekeeper notices that Licorice seems to be in a good mood now, and the girl gets very embarrassed. Later, they return home, and his mother comes running to greet him. She remembers him coming back home and going to the kitchen. She then kidnaps the boy to find out exactly what happened. After that, Pastry is completely exhausted. Zitsu, his father's assistant, comes and offers him some tea, which Pastry accepts. He takes a sip and says it's very tasty. Then, Zitsu asks him about those papers. Pastry says they are wrapping papers for the candies he made. He sent the candies to all the nobles at the tea ceremony, part of his plan for revenge against the problems the Countess caused him with Licorice. Let's go to the Countess, and we see that she's completely furious with Pastry. Now, everyone in the nobility sees her as a woman who likes children, if you catch my drift. She starts breaking things, and her assistant says that after that, several marriage proposals arrived for her, and they're all from children aged 8 to 12. The enraged Countess says Pastry will pay dearly for this. Now, let's head to Marquis Huberek. We see him talking to his assistant. He says Luterud, the Marquis from another region, has begun to act. Huberek says that as he thought, they will act before summer. The Marquis asks how many men he has, and his assistant says about 30,000. Huberek says that due to this number, he will request reinforcements from Duke Cattlesack. Next, Pastry starts counting the money they earned from the candies and the marriage photos. Zitsu asks how he will use those coins. Pastry tells him to buy 100 goats from a traveling merchant and starts fantasizing about all the things he can do with goat milk. Zitsu says they tried to raise goats when they started the estate, but because the soil was infertile and had little vegetation, they ended up releasing them to live better elsewhere. But Pastry says it's different now, they have a lot of vegetation and much more fertile soil. Pastry also mentions that he'll buy some chickens. Zitsu asks if they're for eating, and the boy almost freaks out. He says no, he wants their eggs because many sweets require eggs. After that, Pastry and his friends gather to build a cane squeezer so he can start producing his own sugar. However, Pastry's project doesn't work very well, and they end up breaking it on the first attempt to squeeze. After that, Licorice mentions that where she used to live, they used a different system to squeeze grapes, where two people turned a crank to squeeze the grapes. And so Pastry says that's a good idea and that he'll try it just as she suggested. Soon after, Pastry rushes and tells Zitsu about his new squeezer. But when he arrives at his father's place, they seem a bit tense. Pastry quickly discovers why. He's informed that war has broken out between Huberek's lands and Luterud's. Pastry is completely shocked, and thus today's video comes to an end. Did you like it? Then, my dear otaku, subscribe to the channel here so you don't miss the next video when it's released. Also, drop a like, that really helps me out. And finally, just for those who truly watch until the end, I've left an amazing video on the final screen. It tells the story of Lucille, a guy who was in the wrong place when he was hit by a stray bullet and received a second chance. Now, he'll live as a healer in a world of fantasy and magic. Click and watch, it's incredible.